This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. It's been just under 19 months since the U.S. invasion of Iraq began. And while Iraqi officials and the Bush administration speak of January elections, the situation on the ground remains deadly. Just after midnight local time, U.S. forces struck the city of Fallujah in multiple missile attacks. Al Jazeera reported from the city that at least 6 Iraqis were killed, including at least 4 members of the same family. In an earlier attack, a U.S. bombing destroyed one of Fallujah's biggest restaurants, leaving 2 guards dead. The U.S. military said it was targeting a gathering of supporters of Jordanian militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. An Iraqi journalist in the city disputed the claim. Earlier, U.S. troops fired on a car on the main highway between Fallujah and Ramadi, killing 5 members of the same family traveling in the vehicle. The dead included a woman and child. Meanwhile, a blast occurred near the U.S. consulate in the southern city of Basra, wounding at least 1 Iraqi. The explosion targeted a foreign company specializing in protecting oil pipelines. This weekend, the Los Angeles Times reported that the Bush administration plans to delay major assaults on resistance-held cities in Iraq until after the U.S. elections in November. The paper cites concerns by the White House that such offensives could affect the outcome of the elections. One senior administration official said, quote, "When this election's over, you'll see us move very vigorously." Last December, Democracy Now! Hosted a debate on Iraq between 2 veteran Iraq observers, Tariq Ali, author of Bush in Babylon, The Recolonization of Iraq, and Christopher Hitchens. His latest book is Blood, Class, and Empire, The Enduring Anglo-American Relationship. We're joined in our New York studio by Tariq Ali and in Washington, D.C. studio by Christopher Hitchens. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Why don't we start off with Christopher Hitchens? Your assessment, Christopher, right now of what's happening in Iraq.
I think that the United States and coalition forces are not militarily defeatable in Iraq.
Can you explain what you mean?
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to know first what can't happen. I mean, it helps just to begin by elimination. Military superiority, I've been mocked for saying this in an earlier report from Iraq, but I'm reprinting it in my upcoming collection. Military superiority is something you have to see to believe. Unless the United States chooses to be defeated in Iraq, it cannot be. Therefore, the insurgency, so-called, will be defeated. And all logical and moral conclusions you want to draw from that should be drawn.
Tariq Ali.
Well, I think Christopher is right on this, that militarily it is virtually impossible to defeat the United States. After all, they were not defeated militarily in Vietnam either. It was a big military offensive by the Vietnamese, but had there not been a growing opposition to the war in the United States, a big anti-war movement which penetrated and percolated into the heart of the American army, that war could have gone on. What brought the Vietnam War to an end was the combination of the Vietnamese military offensive and just a refusal by the American public and large sectors of the army to accept that this war was winnable. The question is this: the United States Army cannot be defeated militarily. They're incredibly powerful. But can the Iraqi people be defeated? Can Iraq be anything else but a lame colony, a mixture of Gaza and Guantanamo under foreign occupation? So it's a difficult one, this, and I think a low-level intensity guerrilla war could carry on for years, and the attrition finally could reach such a stage that the United States would say it's not worth it. I mean, as it is today, many conservative people, Edward Luttwak, the Brookings Institute, are saying we should cut and run. It's not been worth it. It's going to end extremely badly, and we should leave before we are humiliated. They don't mean a military humiliation. What they mean is a failure to achieve the goals which this administration situation set itself. I mean, we shouldn't forget that early on we were told it would be a cakewalk. Rumsfeld said maximum this war would only last for 6 months. U.S. administration, Arabs in Washington said they'd be welcomed with sweets and flowers. None of that has happened. And what has become obvious is that the Iraqi people don't like being occupied. They may have loathed Saddam, but they don't like being occupied by the United States itself. And so one has to move to a situation of U.S. withdrawal and the emergence of an elected Iraqi government which will determine its own future, including control of its own oil. There's no other way out.
Christopher Hitchens.
Well, I mean, just as a point of honor, because this is so often used as a taunt, you'd have to call me a liar if you said there was no greeting of American troops. I can't actually vouch for the sweets, but I can sure vouch for the flowers and for a mass outpouring of rejoicing and welcome. I've seen it myself. I'm not going to be persuaded it didn't happen. It may be an unimportant thing, but it seems to have become a regular jeer. It did happen. I saw it myself a lot in all parts of the country. Second, the nature of the enemy is what defines this war, I believe, and makes all comparisons with Vietnam ridiculous. I was on a show I'm sure you sometimes listened to, Amy, Laura Flanders' show, in fact. She began, this is about 6 months ago, I imagine, she began by quoting someone who both Tariq and I respect, Patrick Cockburn of the Independent. It was also, I mean, it doesn't matter to me that she's his cousin, I think, or perhaps his niece. I mean, I've known him longer than she has. And he said about Najaf, the struggle over the mosque there, that if this was the Vietnam War, the Najaf moment would be remembered as its Tet offensive. And I therefore presume, I have to presume, he means that the ridiculous mullah involved would be, I'm not quite sure, Ho Chi Minh. It's at any rate, Mr. Sadr has now been isolated, discredited. His forces have been killed in very large numbers without pity or compunction, I'm glad to say, by American and British forces. He's been broken, and they've been broken morally too. They're rattled, they're shattered, and they're, even today we read, in Sadr city itself, their heartland, so-called in Baghdad, they're queuing up either to sell or give away their heavy weapons. Now that may be a bluff, that's been promised before, but it is not where the Viet Cong were 6 months after the Tet Offensive. So all of this is nonsense, in other words. The United States will not break domestically. Edward Luttwak represents nobody. I'm not even sure he represents himself in this point. The Brookings Institution is virtually irrelevant. People know that they're looking down the gun barrel of theocracy, of a particularly violent, disorderly, cruel, sectarian, fanatical kind, somewhat worse than the Taliban. Since this is an enemy across the globe and in our own society, there is no possibility of surrender with it or of negotiation with it. So that's another respect in which the Vietnam analogy is futile.
Well, in the first place, I think it's extremely important to understand that the people fighting the United States in Iraq are not exclusively religious groups. The religious groups, in fact, are barely involved in the armed struggle. The armed struggle in Iraq today, as any Pentagon analyst will tell you, is being carried out by former members of the Iraqi army, many of them dissidents even during the Saddam years, who decided that Saddam was utterly useless, wasn't going to do anything to defend the country, was incapable of doing so, and months before the invasion happened had prepared that they would wage a long, hard, scorched earth guerrilla resistance. These are not religious people. The religious groups which Christopher is talking about, the Shia groups, in many cases, not in the case of al-Sadr, but in some cases were actually very pro the United States. During the Saddam years, they were being backed by the United States, they were being given money by the United States, and some of these Shia groups are still allied to the United States, others aren't. So you can't pick and choose your theocrats. If they're with us, they're fine. If they're against us, they're a problem. This is a decision, unfortunately, which does not, or fortunately, which does not lie in Christopher's hands or mine. This is something the Iraqi people will decide and determine for themselves when they are given the chance to vote. Now, what happens if in a genuine election, not an election carried out under occupation, the Iraqis decide to vote the Shia parties into power? Are we going to challenge that militarily? Are we going to crush them pitilessly? Are we going to kill them? Because this is what they want. And I think the whole point of toppling Saddam, I was told by Christopher and others, was to liberate Iraq so that the people could determine their own future. Now we are being told that the only people who can determine their future is the United States Army and the Bush administration. And I disagree with Christopher that there won't be a price to pay inside the United States. If casualties carry on at this rate even, there will be opposition in the United States, as there is, which is beginning to percolate through even to the Democratic Party. And I think if Kerry wins, and of course it's a big if, he will be under heavy pressure from day one to organize an orderly withdrawal from Iraq.
We're talking to Tariq Ali and Christopher Hitchens. I wanted to go right now to a clip of the second presidential candidate meeting in St. Louis. This is Friday nights at Washington University. President Bush and Senator Kerry took questions from audience members in a town meeting style debate. This is Anthony Baldy asking Senator Kerry a question about Iraq.
Senator Kerry, the U.S. is preparing a new Iraq government and will proceed to withdraw U.S. troops. Would you proceed with the same plans as President Bush?
Anthony, I would not. I have laid out a different plan because the President's plan is not working. You see that every night on television. There's chaos in Iraq. King Abdullah of Jordan said just yesterday or the day before, you can't hold elections in Iraq with the chaos that's going on today. Senator Richard Lugar, the Republican chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said that the handling of the reconstruction aid in Iraq by this administration has been incompetent. Those are the Republican chairman's words. Senator Hagel of Nebraska said that the handling of Iraq is beyond pitiful, beyond embarrassing, it's in the zone of dangerous. Those are the words of two Republicans, respected, both on the Foreign Relations Committee. Now, I have to tell you, I would do something different. I would reach out to our allies in a way that this president hasn't. He pushed them away time and again, pushed them away at the UN, pushed them away individually. 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting of the North Atlantic Council, which is the political arm of NATO. They discussed the possibility of a small training unit or having a total takeover of the training in Iraq. Did our administration push for the total training of Iraq? No. Were they silent? Yes. Was there an effort to bring all the allies together around that? No. Because they've always wanted this to be an American effort. They even had the Defense Department issue a memorandum saying, don't bother applying for assistance or for being part of the reconstruction if you weren't part of our original coalition. Now, that's not a good way to build support and reduce the risk for our troops and make America safer. I'm going to get the training done for our troops. I'm going to get the training of Iraqis done faster, and I'm going to get our allies back to the table.
2 days ago in the Oval Office, I met with the finance minister from Iraq. He came to see me, and he talked about how optimistic he was and the country was about heading toward elections. Think about it. They're going from tyranny to elections. He talked about the reconstruction efforts that are beginning to take hold. He talked about the fact that Iraqis love to be free. He said he was optimistic when he came here, then he turned on the TV and listened to the political rhetoric, and all of a sudden he was pessimistic. I mean, this is a guy who, along with others, has taken great risks for freedom, and we need to stand with him. My opponent says he has a plan. Sounds familiar because it's called the Bush plan. We're going to train troops, and we are. We'll have 125,000 trained by the end of December. We're spending about $7 billion. He talks about a grand idea. Let's have a summit. We're going to solve the problem in Iraq by holding a summit. And what is he going to say to those people that show up to the summit? Join me in the wrong war at the wrong time at the wrong place. Risk your troops in a war you've called a mistake. Nobody is going to follow somebody who doesn't believe we can succeed, and somebody who says the war where we are is a mistake. I know how these people think. I meet with them all the time. I talk to Tony Blair all the time. I talk to Silvio Berlusconi. They're not going to follow an American president who says, follow me into a mistake. Our plan is working. We're going to make elections, and Iraq is going to be free, and America will be better off for it. Thank you.
you want to follow up, Senator?
Yes, sir, please. Ladies and gentlemen, the right war was Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan. That was the right place, and the right time was Tora Bora when we had him cornered in the mountains. Now, everyone in the world knows that there were no weapons of mass destruction. That was the reason Congress gave him the authority to use force, not after excuse to get rid of the regime. Now we have to succeed. I've always said that. I have been consistent. Yes, we have to succeed, and I have a better plan to help us do it.
First of all, we didn't find out he didn't have weapons till he got there, and my opponent thought he had weapons and told everybody he thought he had weapons. And secondly, it's a fundamental misunderstanding to say that the war on terror is only Osama bin Laden. The war on terror is to make sure that these terrorist organizations do not end up with weapons of mass destruction. That's what the war on terror is about. Of course we're going to find Osama bin Laden. We've already got 75% of his people, and we're on the hunt for him. But this is a global conflict that requires firm resolve.
President Bush, Senator Kerry in their St. Louis debate on Friday night. When we come back, we'll get reaction from Christopher Hitchens and Tariq Ali. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. Back in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The War and Peace Report, broadcasting on over 275 radio stations and television stations around the country, on public access TV, PBS, NPR, Pacifica stations. Welcome to all our new listeners in Vermont today, and on both satellite networks, on Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, and on Link TV, which is Channel 375 of DirecTV. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guests are Tariq Ali, who is in our New York studio. Tariq is the author of, among other books, his latest, Bush in Babylon, The Recolonization of Iraq, also editor of the New Left Review. Christopher Hitchens is with us in Washington studio. His latest book, Blood, Class, and Empire, The Enduring Anglo-American Relationship. Christopher Hitchens, your response to the debate Friday night.
Well, I must say I've never listened to Bush before. I've only sort of watched him, as it were. And there's something even more excruciating, in a way, about just hearing him. But it was a clear knockout, I thought, from his side. I mean, the people I feel sorry for, I mean, pitiful though Bush is, are those who are genuinely anti-war, such as yourself and Tariq, who find themselves having to hope, I presume, for the election of a Kerry Edwards team that is committed to carrying on the war, except without the sense of conviction that, for example, I feel that it's a just war and has to be won. That's an awful position for an anti-war person to be in, I think.
Tariq Ali.
Well, I'm afraid Christopher is right about that. It is an awkward position for us to be in, that the only person, the candidate the Democrats have chosen has been extremely wishy-washy on the war and still can't come clean and say that if this is a wrong war in the wrong place, then the obvious thing to do the minute he comes to power is organize an orderly withdrawal, which is not what he is saying. But nonetheless, my view is that all the leaders who took their respective countries to war have to be defeated electorally, regardless of the quality of the opposition. I think that this was an unjust, illegal, immoral war, and those who took the country to war deserve to be defeated, and then we deal with the people who defeat them.
I wanted to get both your response to a comment made by Richard Pearl, former Pentagon advisor, almost exactly a year ago. He made this comment at a conference organized by the American Enterprise Institute.
And a year from now, I'll be very surprised if there is not some grand square in Baghdad that is named after President Bush.
Richard Pearl, Tariq Ali.
Well, what can one say? I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. I would suggest, however, that when the foreign occupiers finally are forced to leave Iraq, that a tiny public toilet in the big square in Baghdad is named after Richard Pearl in memory of that remark.
Christopher Hitchens.
In a way, I feel pity for, sorry, I seem to be expressing sympathy for everyone this morning. It's not my usual style. Genuine pity for Richard Pearl, because he does or did have quite a good mind, and he's become, as you know, a figure of ridicule and contempt because of his endless double dipping of consultancies with the Turks, consultancies with the Israelis, consultancies now with the not lamented Lord Black, newspaper tycoon. I don't think it's as important a remark as to detain us for long. President Bush doesn't want a square named after himself in Baghdad.
Would you say, Christopher, that you've joined the ranks now of the neocons, of the neoconservatives?
I couldn't quite say that, partly because of the clip you did just show, or the person shown uttering it. I mean, there is a division within the neoconservative movement. It's by the way, one of the tests of its authenticity as a tendency. I would say I was a supporter of Paul Wolfowitz, though, if you want that answer from me.
Yes.
And if you like, I'll illustrate what I think is the difference. There was a lot of argument about the relationship between Iraq and the Palestinian question. Now, there are some of the neoconservatives who I think thought that by taking out the main rejectionist dictatorship in the region, they would make Eretz Israel, or Greater Israel, more secure or more feasible, depending on whether you think Greater Israel has been achieved or not. There were others of the same kidney, if you wish, Wolfowitz among others, who took exactly the opposite view, that if you take out the main rejectionist dictatorship, you're in a stronger position to bring leverage on Israel about the settlements and about expansionism, especially at a time when the Likud party itself is beginning to abandon the ultimate dream of Eretz Israel. A thing that's very seldom noticed about this election, especially on the left, and this surprises me, and I guess I might even get Tariq's half acquiescence on this point. If you care about the rights of the Palestinians, which I do and I know he does and you do, there's absolutely no reason whatever to hope for a democratic victory in November. It's quite obvious to me that the only chance they have is a Bush second term. The possibility that some pressure can be brought on Israel from this quarter, the only quarter that counts, increases if Bush is re-elected. It's an irony, perhaps, but it's not as much of a lousy irony as it would be if the Kerry Edwards ticket was elected, because that's a more or less straight AIPAC Likud ticket.
Tariq Ali.
Well, I must say what Christopher says on this is undeniable. The Democrats have, over the last 20 years, been completely uncritical of every single Israeli government, which has continued to oppress the Palestinians and crush and kill on a daily basis. What I dispute is whether a Bush second victory would be of any benefit in this particular direction, because the whole thing has now been subsumed under the war against terror, so-called. And Sharon became a valued ally of the Bush administration because he was regarded as absolutely central in the war against terror. And every single struggle is now characterized as a struggle against terrorism. I mean, Putin has destroyed half of Chechnya in the name of the so-called war against terror, and Sharon continues to do that in Palestine. And I think unless this administration abandons this whole concept and this whole notion, we're in trouble. And that, of course, applies to Paul Wolfowitz, himself. I mean, I don't know how Christopher sees Wolfowitz as different to, for instance, someone who I know he still disagrees with violently, which is Henry Kissinger. I mean, what makes Wolfowitz different from Henry Kissinger in terms of projecting American power? They are different tactics they have to do this, but by and large, they're very similar people, I would have thought.
Can I recommend, sorry, I'm presuming you want me to reply. I can't see you, Amy, so. Can I recommend a book by James Mann, Jim Mann of the Los Angeles Times, just written a very good book. It's got the rather vulgar title of The Rise of the Vulcans, but it's an examination of the neoconservative tendency in Washington and within the Republican Party. And actually, it takes on the question of Wolfowitz versus Kissinger very well. It's the only book I know that properly does do it. Wolfowitz and Kissinger disliked each other and disagreed very strongly with each other for a long time. I think the origin of the disagreement and the origin of Wolfowitz's political career is he argued that it was important to dump the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, base or no base, let it go and take the chances that this would have a ripple effect in the rest of Asia, which was just what Kissinger didn't want. And as a result, there were outbreaks of democratic insurgency starting with the Aquino election in South Korea, in Taiwan, eventuating in Tiananmen Square, in fact, in '89, which of course Kissinger also opposed and took the side of the Chinese Stalinists. On the Middle East, the victory of the neoconservatives is very paradoxical because contra Bush, Eagleberger, Bush Senior that is, Eagleberger, Scowcroft, I've just mentioned, by the way, the two leading members of the Kissinger Associates, and others, Colin Powell, the argument of the neoconservatives, or at least of the Wolfowitz wing, was we can't go on like this, running the Middle East as a kind of political slum of client states. We have to take the chance that destabilization would be worth it in the long run. That's still why the extreme right in the country, people like Buchanan and others, oppose it, precisely for that reason. They and the pro-Saudi conservatives.
Christopher Hitchens.
So yes, to the extent I'm a neoconservative, it would be because they are the only ones willing to take the radical risk of regime change.
Christopher Hitchens is also the author of The Trials of Henry Kissinger. Christopher, you have written in a piece in Slate talking about Michael Moore, Naomi Klein, Tariq Ali, our other guest here in the studio in New York, as fellow travelers with fascism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that the ideology espoused by people like Zarqawi deserves the comparison with fascism. It's fanatical, it's irrational, it's dictatorial, it's racist, and it's the product of a terrible psychological and sexual repression. It gashes me more than I can easily say, or probably than I have time to say, to hear it called a resistance, or an insurgency, or to have people call, as Tariq, I'm sorry to say, did in the pages of New Left Review some time ago, for solidarity with it. I mean, that is something that I've never heard properly justified or explained. Michael Moore in his film compares these people in Iraq, who, as you know, are the murderers and rapists and torturers, to the founding fathers of the American Revolution. This, to me, is inexplicable. Well, I'm sorry to say, in the case of Michael Moore, it's not inexplicable, but in the case of Tariq, I hope he'll offer a better explanation.
Tariq Ali.
Well, you know, I think words like fascism shouldn't be thrown about lightly, leave alone.
I agree.
Leaving alone. Accusing people you disagree with of being fellow travelers with fascism. I mean, Christopher, from that point of view, is a fellow traveler with imperialism. He's a fellow traveler with people who are carrying out tortures in Iraq. The side he's on has killed several thousand innocent Iraqi civilians, but he supports that war, so you take, you know, what you get. You support a side in the war and you accept all this as collateral damage, including the tortures, which are part and parcel of every single colonial war. And I would urge Christopher very seriously to go back and look at the war that was fought in Algeria. We have a mythology about this war that it was exclusively secular. It wasn't. There was a very strong, whether we like it or not, and I don't like it, because as Christopher knows full well, I'm an atheist. I'm not a believer in any religion. But if you have these countries where a large bulk of the populations are Muslims, obviously Islamic groups play a part in it, as they did in Algeria. As for thinking that...
Which Algerian war are you talking about?
I'm talking about the war against the French.
Not the Islamic insurgency against the FLN.
No,
which was put down by,
hang on, Christopher.
150,000 people.
I know,
in defending the Algerian state from Islamic insurgency.
I know, Christopher, and the reason that particular insurgency started in Algeria is because the military interrupted a democratic election halfway because they thought that their opponents were going to win, rather than letting them win and putting very firm demands on the table that they wouldn't accept any tampering with the constitution. That triggered off the insurgency. That's a different story. Now, to pretend that the entire resistance in Iraq consists of Zarqawi and his group is just completely false. This is a tiny group built up in the Western media largely, attacked by most Iraqis, dissidents of every sort who are opposed to the occupation. And you've got to just accept this. And I don't even support Zarqawi. I've never said I support him. I've criticized him in public, and I've criticized him in interviews with Arab television networks, saying this is not the way. But the resistance in Iraq is much, much broader and much deeper than that. And incidentally, as far as talking about these people having repressive sexual attitudes, this is of course absolutely true, which I have denounced many a time openly and publicly. But what about the Christian majority inside the Republican Party, which you support, Christopher? I mean, whatever else you say about Bush, you can't say his attitudes on homosexuality are particularly enlightened, not to mention capital punishment.
Christopher Hitchens.
Well, I actually couldn't say that I knew what the president's attitude to homosexuality is. I know what his attitude to gay marriage is, but in either event, I think it slightly strains
we just have 30 seconds.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, then I should simply say this. The only really organized rebel force in Iraq, worthy of the name, insurgent force of People's Army guerrilla warfare, is and has been the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and its allies, whose flag I'm happy to wear in my lapel. They deserve the name of a true rebel and People's Army, and they, of course, are fighting for regime change, and as long as they do, so will I.
Tariq Ali, 15 seconds.
I think the Iraqi resistance continues to grow because a colonial occupation has that effect, that even people who might have initially been indifferent or even halfway sympathetic, seeing the effects of a colonial occupation where large numbers, several thousands of innocent civilians are being killed. When you see the pictures from Samarra of women fleeing with their children, it stokes the resistance. Zarqawi is neither here nor there.
On that note, I want to thank you both very much for a very interesting discussion. Tariq Ali is author of Bush in Babylon, The Recolonization of Iraq, editor of the New Left Review, and Christopher Hitchens' latest book, Blood, Class, and Empire, The Enduring Anglo-American Relationship. That does it for the show Democracy Now!, produced by Mike Burke, Sharif Abdel-Qadoos, John Hamilton, Anna Nagar, Elizabeth Press, Jeremy Scahill, Mike DeFilippo, and Ryan Abernathy, our engineers. Look forward to seeing people at NYU today with Toni Morrison at 1:30, tonight at University of Connecticut, WHUS Radio, this weekend in Ithaca and Rochester, California. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.
Christopher, thank you very much.
We're going...